The Whitcomb estate glittered under the crisp December sky, its tall windows aglow with hundreds of flickering candles, reflecting a world of gilt and glass within. Snow fell silently upon the cobbled streets of London, muting the city's usual clamor, as if the night itself had been drawn into the spell of the evening. Inside, the grand ballroom stretched endlessly, polished oak floors gleaming beneath towering chandeliers that scattered prisms of light over elegantly dressed guests. The air smelled of winter roses, spiced wine, and the faint warmth of burning logs from the hearths, mingling in a scent that spoke of tradition and wealth. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb entered as though she belonged to neither the world of gilded expectation nor the whispered gossip it nurtured. Her gown, a deep emerald silk, fell in delicate folds that hinted at movement without commanding attention, while her chestnut hair, loosely braided with sprigs of holly, framed a face both thoughtful and spirited. Guests turned, half in admiration, half in curiosity. Whispers followed her like shadows, acknowledging the quiet audacity of a young woman who refused to let society define her every gesture. Yet even amid the sparkle of the evening, Eleanor carried herself with measured restraint, aware of the keen eyes of her family and the unforgiving weight of propriety. The Duke of Ashbourne moved through the crowd with a grace born of exacting lineage. His presence commanded attention not by force, but by the subtle authority of breeding and impeccable manners. Dark hair swept carefully from a strong brow, eyes of deep, calculating gray, and a posture that bespoke both confidence and restraint marked him as a man of reputation. He was known to all as courteous, disciplined, and remarkably reserved, a man whose every word and gesture had been honed by the demands of aristocracy. Yet Eleanor, standing near the orchestra, met his gaze with a lightness that unsettled the usual rhythm of his composed world. As the music swelled, the Duke approached with the poised elegance of a man long accustomed to both admiration and expectation. Bowing slightly, he extended his hand. "Lady Eleanor," he said, voice rich yet measured, "might I have the honor of this dance?" The question, though civil, carried a weight of expectation. Refusal was almost unthinkable, a deviation from the strict choreography of the evening. Yet Eleanor hesitated, her pulse quickening under the scrutiny of 100 pairs of eyes, each judging, anticipating, cataloguing her every response. She drew a slow breath, lifting her chin with deliberate calm. "I am afraid, Your Grace," she replied, voice soft yet firm, "that I must decline. Tonight, I would rather observe than perform." Her words, courteous but resolute, drifted through the room and landed like a stone in still water. The murmurs began immediately, some admiring her candor, others skiing at the perceived impertinence. A few young ladies gasped, their gloves clutched tightly as though scandal might leap from tongue to reality. Guests craned to see the Duke's reaction, certain that offense or reproach would follow. But the Duke's response was not one of anger, nor of rigid adherence to expectation. He paused, studying her with a look that mingled curiosity and quiet approval, the faintest hint of a smile brushing his lips. Then, with the fluid authority of one accustomed to shaping moments, he raised a hand, signaling the orchestra to cease. The last note lingered in the air, a fragile echo, before he addressed the assembled guests with impeccable courtesy. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe Lady Eleanor requires no further audience. Perhaps the remainder of the evening may be spent elsewhere." The crowd, stunned, hesitated, unsure whether to laugh, to protest, or to retreat. One by one, conversations dissolved, and the guests filed from the hall, leaving the vast room empty but for the Duke and Eleanor. The sudden stillness pressed around her, a tangible contrast to the music and chatter that had filled the space moments before. Candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting the rapid blush on her cheeks, and she realized, with a peculiar mixture of shock and fascination, that the Duke had orchestrated this moment entirely for her. He approached, each step measured, his presence both commanding and reassuring. "You need not fear the world tonight," he murmured, voice low and intimate, carrying a warmth that contrasted with the cold expectation of society outside these walls. "Here, at least, the world may wait." Eleanor's heart thudded in a rhythm unfamiliar and thrilling. Her usual confidence wavered, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and a fledgling trust. "Your Grace," she began, searching for words that would neither betray her surprise nor her growing admiration. "You have—" she paused, uncertain how to complete the sentence without seeming impertinent or audacious. Words felt trivial in the face of such unexpected kindness. "You need not speak," he replied, his gaze steady, almost penetrating. "Let the silence suffice, if you will." There was a gravity in his tone, an understanding that transcended etiquette and expectation, acknowledging the courage it had taken her to act as she did. In that quiet, Eleanor glimpsed the man behind the title. Not merely a duke, but a figure capable of empathy, discretion, and the subtle rebellion of honoring another's autonomy in a world that demanded conformity. Moments stretched, elongated by the hush of the emptied ballroom, the flickering candles, and the soft glow of winter's light filtering through frost-flecked windows. Eleanor found herself both emboldened and disarmed, sensing in the duke's quiet manner a depth unspoken, a curiosity that mirrored her own. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that this night, this singular defiance of expectation, might mark the first step toward a connection that neither society's rules nor her own careful restraint could fully contain. A servant, hesitating at the threshold, offered a timid cough before retreating, leaving the two figures alone once more in the immense, echoing space. Eleanor drew a slow breath, noting the warmth of the firelight on the polished floor, the faint scent of pine from the decorations, and the sense of suspended time that seemed to hang between them. Every detail, the tilt of his head, the measured cadence of his speech, the subtle strength in his posture, felt heightened, significant, as though each gesture carried a weight beyond its simple execution. The duke inclined his head ever so slightly, a signal of patience and expectation without demand. Eleanor, after a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, allowed a small smile to surface, one that acknowledged both the audacity of the moment and the fragile thrill of trust beginning to take root. The hush of the hall, the faint echo of music long ceased, and the soft glow of candlelight framed them in an intimacy that defied the strictures of society, offering a sanctuary in which words, glances, and shared presence carried meaning beyond mere propriety. As the final candle flickered, casting elongated shadows across the parquet, Eleanor sensed the promise of more than a single night of defiance. The duke's quiet respect, his recognition of her will and spirit, suggested that beneath the rigid veneer of titles and expectation lay a possibility for understanding, for intimacy, for a connection neither bound by convention nor constrained by the judgments of others. The ballroom, emptied of all but two figures, seemed almost to breathe in the silence that followed the duke's courteous dismissal of the guests. Candlelight flickered across the polished floorboards, scattering golden reflections onto the walls, and the faint scent of pine and winter roses lingered in the air like a memory. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb stood near the center of the hall, her fingers tracing the delicate folds of her gown, mind alight with both curiosity and apprehension. Though the echoes of departing footsteps had faded, the weight of society's gaze still pressed upon her, intangible but undeniable. Yet here, in this sudden stillness, she discovered a freedom she had rarely known, an intimacy born not of touch, but of presence. The duke approached with measured steps, each one deliberate, carrying the quiet authority that had marked his reputation. His expression was calm, yet Eleanor sensed the undercurrent of something more, a subtle warmth beneath the customary reserve. "Lady Eleanor," he began, voice low and steady, "I trust you were not troubled by the Assembly's expectations?" The phrasing was delicate, a question that offered both recognition and reassurance. Eleanor inclined her head, her lips pressing into a faint smile. "I am accustomed to whispers and glances," she replied, "but tonight they seemed distant, as though removed by some invisible hand." She allowed her eyes to meet his, curious whether he would perceive the deeper truth, that her refusal had been less a challenge than an assertion of self, a quiet rebellion against the dictates of etiquette. He studied her with a patience that was at once unsettling and comforting. "Perhaps," he murmured, "it is not society that is distant, but those who fail to see beyond its surface." The duke's words, carefully measured yet imbued with genuine regard, seemed to settle over her like a mantle of understanding. Eleanor felt a sudden lightness, a rare sense of being acknowledged for her mind and spirit rather than merely her position or appearance. In that gaze, she recognized an intelligence, a depth, and a restraint that mirrored her own, qualities often obscured beneath the rigid masks of rank and expectation. A servant, returning briefly with a tray of untouched refreshments, hesitated at the threshold, as if uncertain whether intrusion would be appropriate. The duke inclined his head ever so slightly, granting permission without a word, and the servant departed with a quiet bow, leaving the two alone once more. The silence that followed was not empty but charged, each breath and glance carrying the weight of thought and unspoken observation. Eleanor adjusted a curl that had escaped her braid, mindful of her composure, yet unable to quell the flutter of anticipation within her chest. The Duke, noting the subtle shift in her posture, allowed a faint, approving smile to touch his lips, a gesture as eloquent as any spoken declaration. Then, with the understated elegance that marked his every movement, he produced from within his coat a small token, a single winter rose, its petals dusted with the faintest frost, cradled in a delicate silver filigree holder. "For you," he said simply, extending the gift. A reminder that even amidst expectation and convention, moments of beauty may exist purely for oneself. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she accepted it, the rose cool beneath her fingers, its delicate form a contrast to the weight of the evening's scrutiny. She glanced up, meeting his gaze, and saw not the formality of a man accustomed to protocol, but a sincerity that cut through pretense and hesitation alike. "The gesture is unexpected," she admitted, her voice soft yet imbued with quiet pride. "I have seldom encountered such thoughtfulness, unaccompanied by duty or ceremony." The Duke's eyes, reflecting the flickering candlelight, held a glimmer of amusement tempered with gravity. "Perhaps you have earned it, Lady Eleanor," he replied. "Or perhaps it is I who am fortunate, to witness a spirit unshackled by convention." His words, though measured, carried an intimacy that Eleanor felt in her bones. It was not mere flattery, but recognition, a silent acknowledgment that her courage and discernment were seen and valued. As they spoke, faint whispers reached the corners of the estate. Servants and family members, unable to resist curiosity, murmured over tea trays and in corridors about the strange events in the ballroom. Some called it scandal, others boldness. Few could parse the truth, that a duke had chosen to honor a young woman's choice above social expectation. Eleanor's chest tightened at the realization that her private assertion of self had already begun to ripple outward, carrying both admiration and quiet censure. Yet, beneath the apprehension, a flicker of exhilaration stirred, a sense of agency and distinction that society's judgment could not wholly extinguish. The Duke, sensing her conflicted thoughts, offered a subtle reassurement. "Let not the idle talk of others disturb the peace of this evening," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "We are accountable only to ourselves, and perhaps to the fleeting truth of the moment." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of his counsel settle over her. There was a depth to his understanding, a recognition that decorum need not suppress intellect or desire, that respect and admiration could exist without ceremony or obligation. In that moment, the space between them, though small, was charged with a delicate energy, mutual curiosity, tempered by restraint, and a growing awareness of possibility. Time, marked only by the faint tick of a distant clock and the soft drip of melting snow against the windows, seemed to stretch, allowing the evening to exist in suspended animation. Eleanor, emboldened by his respect and the rare solitude, ventured further. "Your Grace," she said, voice quiet but steady, "I confess I am unaccustomed to such consideration. It is a privilege I had not imagined, to be granted the choice to refuse and yet not face reproach." The Duke inclined his head, acknowledging both her courage and the subtle honesty of her words. "It is the privilege of those who see with care," he replied. "And you, Lady Eleanor, see with the clarity that many lack." A flicker of laughter, soft and melodic, escaped her lips, a sound that felt entirely her own, unbound by expectation. He responded with a gentle smile, his expression lighting with faint amusement at her candor. In that shared moment, the walls of protocol and rigid hierarchy softened, revealing the contours of human connection beneath. The rose in her hand, a small and fragile emblem, seemed to encapsulate the sentiment of the hour, that even in a world governed by rules and scrutiny, tenderness and recognition might flourish. The distant sound of a carriage horn reminded them of the night beyond the estate, of a city bustling yet oblivious to the quiet intimacy that had taken root within these walls. Eleanor adjusted her posture, lifting her chin with a composed grace, yet her mind remained alight with the unspoken promise of continued conversation and shared discovery. The Duke, noting the subtle determination in her gaze, offered a final, measured observation. "The evening may yet hold surprises, Lady Eleanor. Perhaps we shall see each other again, in a manner less encumbered by expectation, and with time to speak freely of all that lies beyond the public gaze." Eleanor's heartbeat quickened, a flutter of anticipation mingling with restrained excitement. "I would welcome that, Your Grace," she replied, her tone steady yet imbued with a hope that mirrored his own. In that quiet acknowledgment, the future seemed to stretch with possibility, an uncharted landscape of shared moments, intellect, and restrained passion, waiting to be explored. The following evening, London's winter fog clung to the streets like a silken veil, dimming the glow of gas lamps and muffling the city's constant murmur. At the Whitcomb estate, however, warmth radiated from the hearths, and the soft flicker of candlelight illuminated corridors lined with polished wood and richly bound volumes. Lady Eleanor moved quietly through the halls, her footsteps hushed by velvet slippers, heart alight with anticipation and the faint tremor of apprehension. The previous night's encounter with the Duke had unsettled her in the most delicious of ways. The echo of his gaze lingered still, and the winter rose he had gifted her sat upon her dressing-table, a delicate emblem of their unspoken connection. She had agreed, with careful consideration, to meet him in his private study, a room she had seen only briefly before, filled with shelves of leather-bound books, globes, and maps, a space that seemed to breathe with knowledge and quiet authority. As she approached, she noted the soft glow of a fire reflected in the brass fittings of the door, and the faint scent of polished wood mingled with the lingering aroma of spiced wine. Eleanor paused, smoothing the folds of her gown, her pulse quickened not by fear, but by the electric thrill of possibility. The world beyond these walls, with its rigid expectations and critical whispers, felt far away. Here, she was neither subject nor observer, but participant in a shared moment of deliberate intimacy. The Duke rose as she entered, a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgment of her presence. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing slightly, though his eyes betrayed a warmth that transcended the formalities of rank. "I am grateful you accepted my invitation. I hoped, in this quiet, we might speak without the intrusion of expectation." His voice, calm yet resonant, carried the weight of both sincerity and invitation. Eleanor inclined her head, returning the gesture with measured grace. "Your Grace," she replied softly, "it is a rare privilege to converse without the scrutiny of 100 eyes. I am honored." Even as she spoke, she sensed the extraordinary nature of the evening, that the ordinary rules of society had yielded, if only briefly, to something more intimate, more human. They seated themselves near the hearth, where the firelight danced across the Duke's carefully composed features. Shadows traced the lines of his face, softening the austerity that usually accompanied his public demeanor, revealing instead a quiet contemplation. Eleanor's gaze lingered, noticing the subtle tensions in his posture, the faint crease of thought between his brows. "You appear burdened," she observed with gentle curiosity. "Is the weight of your title so relentless?" The question was offered lightly, yet it carried an underlying truth. She sought not to flatter, but to understand. The Duke's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability surfacing. "At times," he admitted, "the expectations of lineage and duty are heavy. One becomes accustomed to compliance, to propriety above all else. Yet there are moments, rare moments such as this, when one glimpses the value of choice, of genuine connection." Eleanor considered his words, feeling an affinity she had not anticipated. "Choice," she murmured, "is the most elusive luxury of our world. We are born into scripts that we are expected to follow without question. To speak, to act, to even breathe differently than prescribed invites judgment." Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, betrayed a slight tremor, a reflection of the mixture of courage and apprehension coursing through her. The Duke's expression was one of keen attentiveness, a study in restraint and care. "And yet," he replied, "there are those rare spirits who navigate society's strictures with integrity and wit, who claim their voice without defiance or disrespect. You, Lady Eleanor, are among them." The intimacy of the dialogue emboldened her to speak more freely. She recounted with careful candor her moments of isolation, the weight of expectations that pressed upon her from family, acquaintances, and the unforgiving gaze of society. Each word was measured, yet sincere, revealing a strength tempered by vulnerability. The Duke listened with a patience and attentiveness that disarmed her defenses. His responses were thoughtful, never intrusive, yet each carried subtle revelation, a hint of loneliness amidst privilege, a longing for authenticity within rigid decorum. Eleanor found herself leaning slightly forward, drawn not by audacity, but by the magnetism of shared understanding. They spoke of art, literature, and the small rebellions of character that defined an individual's life within the constraints of title and inheritance. Eleanor noted the sparkle in his eyes when he discussed a favorite poet, and he, in turn, Noticed the way her hands moved as she described a painting that had moved her, gestures delicate yet expressive. Laughter, soft and rare, punctuated the conversation.